Okay, good afternoon. I see that our virtual room is filling up. So a warm welcome to our first afternoon plenary session on differentiated integration and the future of Europe. What do the member states think? And as you all know, differentiated integration is one of the standard options or scenarios in the debate on the future of Europe, the reform of the European Union, and currently, again, very much in the news as one possible way out of the rule of law European Recovery Fund conundrum. The InDivEU project, integrating diversity in the European Union, which sponsors this panel, so to say. It's a framework in the Horizon 2020 framework of which TEPSA is a member. And the aim of this project is basically to develop research-based assessments and policy proposals on differentiated integration. And when writing the proposal, what we saw was that actually we didn't really know much about member states' positions and preferences regarding differentiated integration. And because, of course, member states are the most relevant actors in negotiating and deciding on differentiated integration, we thought that it would be worthwhile having, say, one work package or module focusing specifically on the comparative study of member state preferences. And it was great to involve our TEPSA members, because that's actually our biggest strength, that we can bring together all of these member states' perspectives based on experts from the country that know the positions of their governments of their country as well. So our panel today will present a snapshot of the findings from this joint research. And I'm happy to present you briefly today's speakers in the order of their appearance. We will start with Stefan Teller, who is a research associate at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. And the EUI actually coordinates that part of our research, and in the framework of our project, he explores what EU member state governments want in terms of differentiated integration. And he's also currently working on a volume on the EU's reaction to Brexit together with Brigitte Laffin. The second speaker will be Dr. Katrin Auel, who is Associate Professor and Head of the Research Group European Governance and Public Finance at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna, Austria. And her research focuses on Europeanization, EU multilevel governance, and legislative study with a focus on the role of national parliaments in the European Union. Our third speaker is Ramūnas Vilpišauskas, who is a professor of the Institute of International Relations and Political Science of Vilnius University. He's also a Jean Monnet chair there for the years 2020 to 2023. And his main research interests include political economy of European integration, policy analysis of public sector reforms, as well as international political economy. Then we move on to Maja Bučar, who is the head of the Center of International Relations at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And she has been working on the monitoring and analysis of EU innovation and research policies, as well as cohesion policies, with a specific focus on the Central and Eastern European countries. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Gunilla Herolf, who is a senior associated research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and has previously worked at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, IPRI, and her main field actually is research on European security cooperation. But of course, all of our speakers in today's sessions are basically have been selected as country experts, yeah, on their country that they work in, and we're very curious to hear the results from this project. And we'll start with Stefan also because he will give us an overview of this project and the comparative findings. So over to you, Stefan. Oh, before I forget this, if you'd like to join the discussion afterwards, there are two ways of doing this. Use the raise hand function that you find on your Zoom screen, or indicate in the general chat that you would like to ask a question or make a comment. Okay, thank you. Now, Stefan, please.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you very much, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to present some of the key findings from our shared research. I've prepared a presentation, and I will try to stick to the 7 minutes allocated to me. So as I said, all panelists have worked on this research project together on the question what the member state governments actually say that they want in terms of differentiated integration. I will be giving kind of an overview of our initial findings, and the other 4 panelists will dive into some of the member states. Yes, our research questions were 2. On the one hand, we wanted to know how important differentiation is for member state governments. On the other hand, we were also interested in the position that member state governments take on differentiated integration. We tried to answer these questions by looking at expressed preferences. So we looked at what the member state governments themselves actually say about differentiated integration. And we did so via a document analysis involving governmental programs, different types of speeches of prime ministers, council statements. And because there we had kind of a poor harvest, we also included parliamentary debates. The scope of this study includes all 27 current member states, and the time period covers 2004 to 2019. Now, how did we try to answer these questions? The question on how important DI is to member state governments was answered by, in fact, counting references to differentiated integration, assuming that the frequency of references to DI corresponds to the importance that governments give to differentiated integration. On the question of what positions member state governments take on differentiated integration, we asked our contributors to quote these references to differentiated integration on a positive negative scale. And most recently, we also have asked them to fill in a survey to provide us with some extra information. This is how we have conceptualized the governmental discourse on differentiation. At the highest systemic level, we distinguish between 2 models, the multi-speed Europe model and the multi-end Europe model. Then we look into 2 different mechanisms through which differentiation happens. On the one hand, enhanced cooperation, on the other hand, opt-outs. And we also, at the policy level, we also looked at 21 instances of differentiated integration in the categories of enhanced cooperation, opt-out, policy fields, inter-se agreements, and external agreements. But today I will focus only on our results regarding DI models and mechanisms. And the first important finding I want to stress is that looking at how important models of differentiation are to member state governments, the answer is, judging by how much governments talk about these models, not that important. If we aggregate the references made by all 27 member states, we rarely find more than 200 references per year, which is very low, we think. And what is more, we do not see a upward or downward trend, but rather what we find is that debates on differentiation peak in certain moments, such as treaty change, but also the Euro crisis, and most clearly the recent debate on the future of Europe. Now, if we look at what governments, on the position governments take on these two models, we can see that in terms of the multi-speed Europe model, the results are quite mixed, with some about 1/3 having a negative view, 1/3 a neutral, 1/3 a positive view. With regard to multi-end Europe, the results are slightly more negative. However, one important caveat applies here. By asking this question at the level of the system, we do not distinguish between whether differentiation is happening through demand for more integration or through demand for less integration. So, for example, a member state may be very positively inclined towards enhanced cooperation, but have a very negative position on opt-outs, and therefore may appear here to have a neutral position. Therefore, we also looked into enhanced cooperation and opt-outs, and what we find here regarding the salience of enhanced cooperation, again, is there's not much debate we find, but interestingly, it seems that with regard to enhanced cooperation, the debate is increasing since around 2010. We find that there is more debate on enhanced cooperation. We find a very different pattern in terms of opt-outs. There is not more debate on opt-outs since 2010. The reason for this, we believe, is that these debates cluster around moments of treaty change and national referenda, and this can also be seen by the fact that the salience here is mainly driven by two countries, which are Ireland and Denmark. Those are the red and blue parts of the bars that you can see here. Now, if we look at the positions member state governments take on these two mechanisms, we see that they are much more positive in terms of enhanced cooperation as compared to opt-outs in a greater number of member states, at least. If we look at change over time, we see that with regard to models and instances, we see an improvement of the assessment of all except for opt-outs again. Then two final slides on the consistency of the position that member state governments take. We ask them whether they have a consistent position across all these three levels of models, mechanisms, and instances. That would mean if a member state has a negative position on two-speed Europe, it would also have to reject the use of enhanced cooperation and opt-outs with regard to specific policies. In most cases, we find that governments are rather pragmatic and have inconsistent positions. Our hunch is that the explanation herefore might be that governments have different preferences with regard to the European Union as a whole and with regard to specific policies. Therefore, there sometimes may be inconsistency between those two. And finally, we also looked at what influence party ideology may have had. And so far, what we are seeing, perhaps surprisingly, is that in most member states, there seems to have been no big impact in terms of party ideology. We suspect that the reason for this may be the fact that the salience of differentiated integration is very, very low in many member states, and therefore DI may not be an important issue for parties in the mass politics arena. To summarize our results in terms of salience, it is rather low, and we don't really see a strong trend, but rather we see peaks. In terms of position, the acceptance of differentiation models and mechanisms seems to be increasing, except for opt-outs, which are viewed rather negatively, while enhanced cooperation is viewed rather positively. Party ideology, less important than we expected. And finally, we may have to distinguish between what member states want in terms of differentiation of the European Union and in terms of what they want from specific policies. I leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, also for keeping in time, and immediately pass on to Katrin.
Thank you very much. I also had it structured along salience on the one hand and the position of the Austrian government on the other hand, but the salience part is going to be slightly boring because it follows very, very much the pattern of what Stefan just presented. So what we can find is that differentiated integration is simply not a salient issue in Austria, at least not from the documents that I've coded together with my colleague Anna Pixer. The topic it's such and the specific keywords have come up very, very rarely over the last 15 years that we looked at. To give you just some numbers of the conceptual keywords related to the two DI models, we found around 140 mentions over those 15 years. Of the specific terms opt-out or enhanced cooperation, we found of which 80% were opt-out because it's a word that's been co-opted into the German language as well. But what, of course, is very salient are the underlying policy issues. Clearly, Schengen, EMU, CSDP, ESM, the fiscal compact, public prosecutor, all of these different policies have had very intense debates in Austria. So when it comes to the specific DI instances, we found over 5,000 mentions in the various documents. What these numbers show is that all of the related policies do play a role, but when they are discussed, they are very rarely discussed with sort of in a more general frame of debates focus on the underlying models or concepts or on visions for the EU. And it's my internet is just telling me that the connection is unstable, so I'm really hoping I don't cut out. When it comes to the position, we found that when indeed concepts or models of differentiated integration are discussed in Parliament, they surprisingly usually have a negative connotation, at least for most of the parties. So in Austria, party ideology does play a role, and I will say a bit more about that later on. As you know, sort of the question of the subsidiarity principle and a strong lobbying for the EU to focus on its main task have always been important in the Austrian discourse, and the salience of the whole subsidiarity issue has even increased in recent years, especially under Chancellor Kurz. On the other hand, we can see that even though there might be this focus on concentrating on sort of the specific core tasks of the EU, there is at the same time a vision of the EU that is that of a community of closely cooperating member states who all have the same rights and responsibilities. So as a result, opt-outs are usually seen as cherry picking. And we can see that we have a peak in the data, for example, in 2007, when criticism especially focused on the United Kingdom's opt-outs regarding the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So what we also found interesting is most parties rarely use the term core Europe, which in German would have a more positive connotation, and mainly refer to the Europe à la carte or Europe of two speeds, which usually comes with a negative connotation. So give you just two quick example quotes. So one junior minister from the SPÖ said, "I found the remarks on the two speeds interesting. If a car were traveling with two different speeds, that vehicle would normally get torn apart. Europe would, of course, face the same danger." then MP and former Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel, for example, said, with 500 million people and 27 states, there will be no Europe à la carte, where anyone can practically choose in a modular system what they like best. There must be rules of the game. In 2008, this explicit opposition was even spelled out in the government program of the incoming grand coalition between Social Democrats and the Austrian People's Party, where it says Austria will also in the future participate actively, fully and equally in all policy areas. We reject variable geometries that exclude Austria. Generally, we oppose new dividing lines in Europe, for example, in the form of a core Europe. Sorry, did someone say? No. So there's only party that has fairly openly and forcefully supported the development of a core Europe, and that is the Eurosceptic and right-wing populist Bündnis Zukunft Österreich, the Alliance for the Future of Europe, of Austria, a splinter group of the Freedom Party under Haider. However, in this case, support for differentiated integration is based less on an aim to allow sort of a small group of member states to move ahead in specific areas, but it was rather a means to exclude specific groups of member states, especially financially more vulnerable net recipients, from areas of integration. To give you again sort of a very illustrating quote from one of the debates, one can't compare Austria and Germany and Holland and Great Britain with those which newly joined, with Romania, with Bulgaria and other countries. They can't all be tarred with the same brush. That's why we said there must be a core Europe, a core of the European, of the best developed countries. And let me close with a few exceptions. So as I said, generally the main parties in Austria reject ideas of differentiated integration. There's a strong belief that every member state who is a part of this union should have the same rights and responsibilities. There should be no cherry picking. However, every once in a while, Austria has very, very strongly supported specific mechanisms and instances of DI. But only as a second best alternative if the underlying goal cannot be reached with all member states. And here the financial transaction tax, which has been a huge issue in Austria, is one of the examples. So time and again, they have stressed that they would like a European or even ideally globally solution or introduction of the tax. But when it was clear that an agreement would not be found, they were willing to settle for an introduction through enhanced cooperation. And we find similar things in other areas. For example, the Austrian government also successfully lobbied for a general opt-out from certain genetically modified organisms from the list in the directive, I think. But here again, we can see that there's an avoidance of cherry picking because they lobbied not for a specific Austrian opt-out. Genetically modified organisms is a big issue in Austria, but they rather lobbied for all member states to have this opt-out. So overall, very low salience, not a big issue, but generally viewed negatively. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Katrin. We actually heard you well in spite of some technical glitches.
Perfect, thanks.
And we move on to Ramūnas, please.
Thank you, Frank. I would also like to thank the organizers of this session for inviting me, and also for the initiators of the project, which I found very interesting. And I look forward to general, more elaborate conclusions, comparative conclusions of all EU member states. What I will be speaking about will be, of course, related to Lithuanian government's position on DI, but from what I know, it should apply also to Latvia and Estonia, other two Baltic states more or less similarly. And I have three short points that I would like to make. One on salience of DI, another one on position of Lithuanian government, and the third one on terminology, how it is understood in Lithuanian political debates. So what concerns salience, generally speaking, the salience of DI models, mechanisms, and instances in political debates in Lithuania has been low, with two exceptions. One, and the most important exception, has to do with two instances, two opt-outs, which were important from the start of EU membership when Lithuania acceded in 2004. And these two were membership, well, rather opt-out from Schengen area and Eurozone. These two opt-outs were considered important in a sense of the need to terminate them as soon as possible. So they were also called integration leftovers or incomplete integration projects. So one can find a lot of references to the need to join Schengen and Eurozone as soon as possible in all official documents, government programs, and some presidential speeches, European policy strategies. So these two instances were very salient. Another exception, which is quite permanent, is reference to closer EU's relations with Eastern Partnership countries. Here, Lithuanian government sees itself as one of the main advocates of Eastern Partnership countries in the European Union, and independent of which parties are in power, which are in coalition, closer relations between Eastern Partnership countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the EU have been given quite a lot of attention in each government program since 2004 until now. So these are the salient issues. Generally speaking, debates about modes or mechanisms or other instances of DI are well, not salient in Lithuania, generally speaking. What concerns the second point, the position of Lithuanian institutions, obviously it was negative with regard to discriminatory opt-outs from Schengen and Eurozone. After membership in these two schemes was achieved, it became, I would say, selective or pragmatic, depending on particular instance of enhanced cooperation or opt-outs being considered. So Lithuania decided on economic grounds not to be part of financial transaction tax initiative. Similarly to Latvia, Estonia actually joined initially but later left on the same grounds. Lithuania also is not part of a couple other initiatives such as property regimes of international couples and Prüm Convention. So it is selective. In some debates, this possibility not to take part in enhanced cooperation is seen positively, in some cases negatively. And this leads me to my third point regarding the terminology in political debates. There is a widespread confusion of two DI modes. Let's say two-speed Europe is often confused with two-tier Europe. Multiple-speed Europe is confused with multiple-tier Europe or Europe à la carte and Europe of concentric circles. So if one reads parliamentary debates, you can see that members of parliament often confuse those notions, and generally when they speak about those different modes of DI, they perceive them negatively as a reference to a core of rich and powerful member states, most often Germany and France, and periphery of poor and vulnerable states, which also include Baltic states. And of course, this division, which is seen as a threat of DI, is considered negatively. But when it comes to concrete instances, and most often these instances are discussed when particular law needs to be adopted in the parliament and government has to present to the members of parliament the origins of this legal amendment, which relates to particular instances of DI, I would say we coded them neutral in most of the cases because well, sometimes they are regarded positively, sometimes members of parliament simply confuse what they are confused about the exact meanings. Thank you very much. I hope I have not exceeded my time.
Not at all, thank you. And so not to lose time, we move on to Maja immediately, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being part of this project. When we were invited, we were first quite doubtful whether we can really contribute something, because the issue of differentiated integration, as it proved also through the analysis of the documents, is more or less a silent issue in Slovenia. We were lucky to have access to something which is called Clarin project, which is a European research infrastructure for language resources and technology. Slovenian partners in this project are now archiving all of the parliamentary debates, not just the parliament, but also the parliament committees of various kinds. So we had access to more than 10,000 different sessions, recording of the sessions for all this period. Even this didn't really help us much, because differentiated integration was not, the keywords that we put in were really not mentioned much in any of the debates. So we also, like everybody else, looked at additional documents and analyzed those. One of the reasons for low salience, I think it's also because the very issue of European politics, or EU in general, was not really mentioned much in all of these parliamentary debates. There are two instances that we depicted out of all of this database, or this huge database. One referred to the use of structural funds and participation of Slovenia and the dynamics of drawing on the funds, and the other, the issue of uptake of various EU legislation. This were the two that struck us as something which the parliament did spend some time on, whereas on the issues of differentiated integration, similar to what Stefan was pointing out, we have peaks again after the crisis and the 2017 debate on the future of Europe, which was really much more prominent in terms of mentioning differentiated integration. Now, the position of the government through the years, and I'm excluding here the very last months of some changes happening now in Slovenia, was that we always wanted to sort of, in all the documents, we saw this stress of having to build towards strong and united EU, because this is something which is very important also for Slovenia and will keep us on the right track as well. We keep on seeing policymakers referring to Slovenia wanting to belong to the core in a sort of positive sense. We want to be with those who are the most advanced, those who are promoting the closer cooperation. So this was our definition of a core, why we want to be there. In a more elaborate discussion, we found some fears expressed that we may not be really able to participate with this core from the point of view of being a small country with limited human resources and also limited knowledge on all the issues which are important for the further integration of the EU. So this was coming more, I would say, even from the academic circles than necessarily politics. This fear that we are not doing enough, that we are not investing enough in learning about the EU issues to be really taken on board seriously as members of this core. So this was something which was very much stressed, in particular, I would say, debates at the Committee on the European Affairs, less so in the speeches of the prime ministers, where we only found maybe some citations referring to, yes, we want to be integral part of EU. EU is important for the Slovenia's future, and that's where we are heading. You may have noticed that recently we are now, not we, I would not say Slovenia, I would say exclusively our prime minister is moving more towards the Visegrad group, and is stressing this also in his speeches. I would say that overall in general public, but also even in his coalition partners, this has been criticized as saying that this is not the strategy that Slovenia has in its foreign policy, that the foreign policy remains focused on being closer to the key members of the EU and wanting to be a part of closer integration, and not going in the direction of Hungary or Poland that he is now simply, I guess, befriending more and more. This, of course, has caused some tensions, and we will see how far this goes. But as I said, in terms of DI, this has not been a major issue. And if there was an issue, it was we have to be members of the first tier, so-called, and we have to do everything for that, because a multi-tier Europe for a small and less developed country means fewer opportunities for development, fewer possibilities to grow and develop both economically and socially. I think this is from my part.
Thank you very much, Maja. And last speaker is going to be Gunilla, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for having the opportunity to listen to all the other countries and to compare the similarities and the differences, because there are both of these. Differentiated integration is of very low salience in Sweden, and there are very few references to this concept if we look at the government programs and also the parliamentary debates. If we look at the keywords for DI models, we have a few more. Multi-speed is more frequently used, but it's also been seen very negatively. The view in Sweden is that it might lead to diminished cohesion within Europe. I notice similarities there. Multi-end, on the other hand, is not a problem, which is not so strange, considering that Sweden is not part of the euro. So it is quite an example of this. If we look at the DI mechanisms and come to the enhanced cooperation, Sweden is quite relaxed, which is of course consistent with its view on multi-end Europe. Sweden has not seen it as a problem when others have engaged in enhanced cooperation for initiatives that Sweden disagrees with. And it's also quite pleased when initiative that Sweden favors can be pursued as enhanced cooperation if they do not get the acceptance of all. Most of the instances that Stefan has brought up are seen as positive by Sweden, and the argument is quite often that they are seen as in some way increasing efficiency. This goes, for example, for PESCO, even though Sweden would have preferred PESCO to be within the EU, but it's still positive. Prüm is positive, the public prosecutor, matrimonial property regimes, unitary patent and its court. And only two of them are considered very negatively. These are the financial transaction tax, which is seen as very easy to circumvent by moving to places with lower taxes, which is of course also an efficiency viewpoint. And it's the Rome 3 regarding rules for divorce, which is about legitimacy in Sweden. Sweden can't accept that Swedes would undergo a divorce under the laws of a country that is less liberal on divorce issues than Sweden. That's the reason. On the opt-out side, of course, there is the discussion about the euro. two particular parties, the Left Party, which is on the very left side, and the Sweden Democrats, which are on the far right side, have both asked for a formal opt-out. And the argument, or rather the motive behind it, I would say, is that this would make it more difficult for Sweden to join if Sweden would so wish. Other parties would prefer to leave things as they are. According to the Swedish government, there is no pressure from the European Union to have a formal opt-out, and most probably for the same reason. It would be more difficult to join them. I guess that this would be far into the future, but no one knows. At the moment, there are only about 20% of the population that are positive to joining, but it may change quickly. We had a referendum in 2003, which ended with 42% for joining. I was one of them, I must say, so that you know. And 1 year before that, we had 58% for joining, but things happened in those years. To the conclusion, Swedish politicians are not very interested in institutional issues. They are interested in political issues. They are highly pragmatic, as defined in the project. It's political views, nothing else, which decides which position to take. The views among the parties are strikingly similar, and they don't vary over time either. The exception are the two parties that I have mentioned, but even they differ on only 2 or 3 issues. Finally, as mentioned before, multi-end solutions are fine with Sweden, but, and this is said many times, Sweden sees it as crucial that all the important decisions that affect the whole of the EU should be taken by the 24 members and not by a smaller group. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gunilla. Thanks to all the speakers for their crisp and focused statements. I think that should give us a good foundation for the discussion. So we still have 15 minutes or so in this short session, and I would like to encourage you to either use the chat to indicate that you have a question, or to use the raise hand function on your screen. So I thought this was really an interesting analysis that really brought out some general features. Yeah. So one hunch I get from this is that this entire debate about differentiated integration and its different modes and types, that it's really a lot of Euro speak, and it's something that academics and European technocrats or policymakers can get excited about, but it hasn't really reached, let's say, the national political arena. Yeah, where so it's really doesn't. I mean, as a general matter, it doesn't really seem to be a politicized issue, or one that parties compete on a lot. So also it seems that governments or parties don't really have a grand strategy when it comes to differentiated integration. So it's not really a concept that they use to motivate, let's say, general attitudes towards the European Union. But at the same time, I found it curious that when it comes to specific issues, then governments and also parties seem to have strong issues, strong concerns and strong positions when it is about not being excluded from specific policies, yeah, or being part of specific policies. So it really seems to be a policy by policy discussion rather than one of grand strategy, as which it has been introduced, for instance, in the white paper of the European Commission. Yeah, so there is definitely a certain disconnect here between the, say, the strategic and the academic debate and what we see in the national political arenas. Okay, as I've been speaking, and that was the purpose, some hands have been raised. And the first one is Jaap de Swaan. So Jaap, please.
Thank you, Frank. My question is not so much about the Dutch position. I mean, perhaps 2 sentences. The Dutch position, I think, generally speaking, as you say, by the way, at the political level, there is not that much interest, except if it serves our interests. So, generally speaking, Dutch politics takes a kind of opportunistic approach. When it suits our interest, then we are in favor. If not, then of course we favor a more global approach. Now, my question, and I do not know exactly, it is more of a legal nature, and perhaps I address it in the first instance to Stefan, because he was drawing up the statistics and whatsoever, and it shows indeed enhanced cooperation. If there is a support, then that kind of principle might receive most support, although in a limited manner. Now, I think also I'm not so much in favor of inventing categoric instruments, the opt-outs, full derogations, but I'm sometimes reflecting as an academic about the reforms, possible reforms of enhanced cooperation. The first being that why not, once that instrument has been applied, that we consider the outcome of the decision-making as integral part of the European Union acquis. So for the moment, as everybody knows, those who participate in enhanced cooperation are the only ones who are bound. But I think in order to bring the European Union political and legal order a bit further, we should reflect about possible reforms. Another one, which is a bit more fundamental one, is that I think we should reframe this principle, not so much in the sense, how can we possibly facilitate minorities, the 9 member states and so on, but how can we facilitate majorities? So without attaining the level of qualified majority. So I'm sometimes in my academic work, I'm looking for possibilities to reform this principle. Also, one of the major characteristics of that is that we should not exclude any member state. So two proposals for reform. The first one, to include it in the EU acquis, differently as the situation is now. And furthermore, to develop it into a direction that you really can say we facilitate majorities of member states. And sometimes I use the example of 3/4 of the member states, but then of course you get very close to the requirements of qualified majority, etc. So I'm looking to an option in between, and of course the idea being, and in an academic context, we can make that kind of reflection to bring European Union as a political and legal framework a bit further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jaap. I propose to collect a few more. Next is Michael Käding, and then we have Funda Tekin, and then I'll give the floor back to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Frank. I have 2 questions. After having listened to all the country perspectives specifically, I somehow got more interested in the conceptual framework presented by Stefan, because I somehow there were statements made like we expected many more debates. 200 is very low, and I always kept on asking myself, so compared to what? Maja was referring to basically the Clarin network, and I think we at the University of Duisburg-Essen also are part of the Clarin network. So I think so it would be probably nice to compare these figures with other European debates, with other statistics you have, to actually make this comparative point, because you make a very crude kind of assumption, right? That frequency is important, and if you do this, I think it would be really nice to put this broader, to link it to other EU debates, and to compare this so that we actually have comparison, because we might be surprised that the findings as we find here, that there is a disconnection, but that maybe the disconnection overall in EU on EU affairs is actually quite prevalent in comparison to other national debates. And the other point is, in presenting your data, also I listened very carefully. I think with Sweden became very clear that seems to be a country, if I understood correctly, very cohesive in what it does. It does not, because you had a graph where you actually listed that quite a three-quarter of member states or so, they were incohesive in their responses and so on and so forth. And this is now a general comment. I think all the data you provided were more like percentage kind of perspectives, but this is not something I would be very much interested in when I am interested in member states' perspectives, right? So I would like to see whether there are clusters of countries. So please do open the box and help us to see whether there actually are country clusters fitting into the various boxes, because as the way the data was presented is the first step, but actually I would like to see much more that is behind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Very useful comments. Funda, please.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for sharing your highly interesting research findings and the research you've done with us. And I think I can just link up to the first comment that Michael just said, because I think my expectations would have been exactly that you would have difficulties of finding a true political debate on differentiated integration or much mentioning of that, because I share your assessment, Frank, that what you also mentioned then while we were taking time to raise our hands, is basically that it is, differentiated integration, or the approach to differentiated integration is rather a pragmatic one. So whenever it's needed, you find a solution. This is exactly what you found, with regards to the opt-outs at times of treaty changes, and then more multi-level or multi-speed differentiations in between. But my question would rather be, and this is also reflects to the overall links up to the overall framework of the analysis. And the thing that you then also mentioned, Stefan and also Frank, is the fact that, it's more policy related rather than polity related in terms of, having a big strategy behind the differentiated integration or the approach to differentiated integration. I was just wondering if this is the case, and I really agree and share your assessment on that, but wouldn't there be then a risk of ending up with an a la carte Europe if it's really only policy focused instead of having an overall approach? Just if you could elaborate on that a bit more.
Okay, so I think we should give it back to the speakers. I think most of the stuff was addressed to you, Stefan, so maybe you should start, and the others can come in if they'd like to contribute afterwards. I leave it up to you.
Thank you very much for all your questions. I'm not sure that I can say much on the first set of questions regarding enhanced cooperation and the legal questions behind that. So I think I will leave that to the other panelists. So I would like to come to the question of questions regarding our conceptual framework and salience compared to what, especially. So first of all, I want to say that on the one hand, our conceptual framework definitely has some shortcomings. Just counting keywords and assuming that this says something about salience, it was a pragmatic decision that we made to enable this analysis to be conducted in 27 different member states. And there are definitely some shortcomings, but on the other hand, I also, for reasons of time, was not able to explore everything we did today in our presentation. So what we also did for all the member states in all reports was to look into the frequency of EU-related issues. So we were looking at such things as the Euro crisis and other EU-related issues that may come up. So we used those issues then as a benchmark for the salience of discussions about differentiation. So in short, what we found usually is that member states do talk a lot about EU-related issues, but they do not talk about it in terms of differentiation. So that is one point. We try to introduce such a benchmark in one way or another. The other point I would like to make is that we did not only use keyword counts, but we also asked all our contributors to go into the documents and do a qualitative assessment of what they find in government programs, so that we also catch references to differentiation that we do not get from our keywords. And therefore, all the contributors read in detail the governmental programs, the speeches, but of course, not all the parliamentary debates. So we try to somehow also take that into account. Then maybe to the question of Sweden being very coherent, but me showing in the presentation only percentages instead of country clusters. That is something that we are working on right now. The survey, we're still working on our survey data and have not quite finalized that, but exactly the country clusters and territory spatial differences is something that we want to look into. What we're working on at the moment is a paper that looks into the hypothesis of origins for demand for differentiation coming from being related to the size of a member state, the wealth of a member state, and identity of a member state. So that's what we are going to do next. So I hope we will have results on that early next year. And maybe finally on Funda's question, if we see that DI debates are driven or focused mainly on policy rather than polity, do we then not end up with a la carte Europe? What I want to say to that is that I want to talk a little bit about Ireland. Ireland is a country that was quite skeptical about enhanced cooperation because it was afraid that as a small country it might be left out and lose some of its leverage at the European level. At the same time, Ireland was, for pragmatic reasons and its close alignment with the UK, using several opt-outs. And then what you find later on in debates is statements that say, okay, so now we do have these opt-outs. We are against, in many cases, enhanced cooperation, but now we see that we are drifting out of the core, perhaps. So this is becoming a risk. And so we see, I think over time, the debates moved from policies, opt-outs and enhanced cooperation to debates about whether and how Ireland can remain a core member state. Yes, I would leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. What I propose, since we have one more request for an intervention, I would take that now and then give the other speakers a chance to respond or to bring in additional points in a concluding round, because we are running out of time. So Uffe, please, you raise your hand.
Yes, hello. I was just inspired with this round of member states and member states' voices, and I'm from Denmark, and I would just give a few examples here from Denmark about DI and other subjects. Denmark has an opt-out in defense, and I've just been to meetings about what does it mean for Denmark to have this in defense cooperation, and does it mean that Denmark is less attractive to work together with other countries? In the recent debate in Denmark, we have been talking about migration and do we need better cooperation and solidarity? And what about the democracy challenge and the budget, Poland and Hungary? What does it mean with EU relation to Russia and USA? That was just very short to mention some of the things going on in Denmark now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Uffe. And so I see Ramūnas wanted to come in again, and then I maybe you can start, and then I give the floor to the others if you like. Gunilla, yes, okay.
Yes, just very quick reaction to the question about comparative salience. Indeed, we were using other keywords like Europe, Eastern Partnership, energy security in the case of Lithuania, when we were analyzing policy documents and parliamentary debates, and so that was one of the benchmarks, so to speak. And also, as Stefan said, we read all the government programs and European policy strategy documents. And what surprised me most probably is that in those European policy priority documents that were prepared by the government, we had 3 of them since 2004. This DI terminology is also very rarely used. So this is surprising, having in mind that these documents are written by people who are very well familiar with Euro jargon. So yeah, what we have is this strange mismatch between political debates about two-speed, two-tire, whatever Europe in the parliament, which is, as I said, something very negative that threatens unity of the EU, and then very pragmatic, selective discussions on particular instances of DI, of enhanced cooperation and opt-outs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramūnas. Gunilla, please. Everyone else, please, only 60 seconds because we are over time.
Thank you. I'll be very short. Yes, as Stefan has also mentioned, there are problems with counting keywords. You don't find the discussions when they are not using the right keywords. And I've seen quite a number of these discussions happening. So that is definitely a drawback, but it's also, on the other hand, very difficult to find any other good way of doing it. So it's not a criticism, it's only something that we have to carry with us. So there is a lot of discussion, and maybe we can make some shorter focus, more focused in the future about some of these issues, and we can catch the depth of some of the discussions instead. About Sweden being cohesive, yes, it is to a large degree cohesive when it comes to these issues. There are, of course, wild discussions in Sweden as well, but on the particular issues of the European Union, there is not much disagreement. The only party that really breaks out are the Sweden Democrats. Among the others, the differences are actually very small in this respect. That's all.
Katrin?
Thank you. I also wanted to come in quickly on the question of comparison, and the others have already mentioned how difficult it is to find a concept that is in some way, or concepts that are in some way comparable to differentiated integration. I think just using large policy areas might also provide you with a very skewed picture. We followed I think the suggestion of the Irish team and compared references to the future of Europe as sort of one big concept. And interestingly, we found that the mentions of the DI models and mentions of the future of Europe and related debates didn't coincide, they didn't overlap, with the only exception being the period of 2007-2008, so Lisbon Treaty. But otherwise, they were almost opposed. So differentiated integration is not discussed in the context of future of Europe debates.
Maja.
Well, just briefly, I think the fact that now we have different keywords being used in different countries may make difficulties for comparison, but on the other hand, I think this was essential because in each language, I think there are different expressions which the national members of the parliament are using to refer to this. So for us, this was a necessity. We had to look at the documents, identify keywords, and then we were able to proceed with identification of how many times this gets mentioned. And I think this yes, it limits the comparison component, but it allowed for the words to be found at all. Otherwise, we would come up with nothing.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the speakers for a very focused and coherent presentation of the research results, also for sticking to the time limits. And I'd also like to thank the audience for participating. I was asked to remind you that this session will be followed by the concluding remarks of our TEPSA PPC conference. So stay with us, stay tuned, and otherwise have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.